What inspired you to write Learning Through a Prism?
Well, it started with my own personal experience of studying abroad. I had multiple study abroad experiences, and I knew I had this really profound learning experience, but I didn't really know how I got there, and I really struggled with the vocabulary of what it was that I had done and how to sort of transfer that into new contexts. But I felt like it was really important and really meaningful. I did a master's thesis in intercultural communication, and what I found from that was that students who go abroad do have these tremendous learning experiences, but it's not just going abroad that makes them have that. There's something else going on. So that started me down this path of what else is there going on that makes this learning happen. So those two pieces together made me really want to think about what it is that creates good learning in study abroad. What do we call this? What are the ways that we tease this out? And how do we turn this into an academic field? A lot of the things that I first found when I was trying to wrap my mind around this were really things that were framed sort of like icebreaker activities or anecdotal kinds of experience things. There wasn't like this academic vocabulary around it. So for me, it was culminating all of this, a desire to create this academic language around what the learning is that takes place in study abroad, and then provide methods and approaches for us in the field, us as educators, to help get our students to that place, knowing that it doesn't just happen automatically.
If you had to point to a few key lessons that you've learned from your own experiences studying abroad, what would they be?
First, I'd say to get outside of your comfort zone. And it's so cliche and it's so obvious, but we often don't really think about what our comfort zone is. There's our cultural comfort zone, and then there's our personality comfort zone. So I talk about my personality. I'm a perfectionist, I'm an introvert, and for me, the experience of going abroad and getting outside my comfort zone is learning to make mistakes and being okay as a perfectionist with making mistakes, learning to talk to strangers and being okay as an introvert with talking to strangers. So it's that sort of personality aspects as well as the cultural aspects of getting outside of your comfort zone, of eating unfamiliar foods, of practicing habits that are different than what you're used to, of taking transportation that's different than you're used to, of engaging in ways that you're not used to. So all that sort of falls under the rubric of getting outside your comfort zone. And I think secondly, it's recognizing that this is everything that you do abroad is an opportunity to learn. So the idea of being willing to listen with humility and to learn, to recognize that you're not always right. And then the third key thing that I'd say is that when I talk to students about what it means to learn another culture, to acculturate to a new place, to gain these skills, I always say it's about not changing who you are, but adding a new dimension. And so that's part of what that's part of what the imagery and the messaging is of PRISM, is that we're adding another dimension to who we are. We're not changing who we are, but we're adding another component and another layer. And that's a beautiful thing. It's not something to be afraid of.
Great. What advice, this kind of ties in with that, but what advice would you give to faculty thinking about organizing a study abroad experience?
What I would tell faculty is to articulate both primary and secondary learning outcomes for their study abroad programs. So the primary learning objectives or learning outcomes are things that faculty are really familiar with doing. This is how we build courses, this is how we design syllabus. We think about what those discipline-specific learning goals are. And so that becomes really clear and obvious to faculty. But what often is underlying and not always articulated is those secondary learning outcomes, which is the whole point of going abroad. The idea that students are going to apply what they're learning in new contexts, that students are going to see different ways of doing things, that students are going to get outside their comfort zone. And this is indeed the whole reason that they're taking students abroad, but without that, taking that extra time of articulating that as a learning objective and then thinking concretely about how to build that in, you're not going to achieve that. So what we see is that everyone naturally resorts back to doing things that are within their comfort zone, that are familiar to them. And so, I'll talk to faculty who will say, they're in this new place and they're not even taking public transportation. They're still taking Ubers and taxis everywhere, or they're seeking out the American food. And, I'm really disappointed because they're not embracing the culture. And so I say we have to go back a step then and articulate that as one of our learning outcomes, and then give them steps to practice doing that, first together and then on their own. That's what makes it easier for students to do these things, and that's essentially what the book is all about.
So then on the flip side of that, what advice would you give to students going abroad?
A lot of these same sorts of things. So again, the idea of getting outside of your comfort zone and doing things that are unfamiliar to you. Of course, this doesn't mean doing things that are unsafe, but doing things that feel awkward and that feel different is where learning takes place. One of my favorite quotes is from Winston Churchill, and he says, "I always want to learn, but I'm not always ready to be taught." And so this idea that learning happens often if we open ourselves up to being taught by other people, being taught by situations, being taught by the environment, the things that are going on in the experience. And so it's really about being open to that and being flexible. Flexibility is the name of the game when it comes to being in a new culture. So again, students gravitate to going abroad because they want some things to be new. They want to be flexible about some things, but they often don't realize that there's this whole host of other things that you have to be open to and that you have to be flexible about, whether it's how your Coke is served without ice, or whether there's air conditioning or not, or how much walking you need to do, or any of those kinds of things. So recognizing that openness applies to this minutia and huge level of things that you have to do throughout your day. That's what you're seeking out, and that's what I'm calling you to do while you're there, is to embrace all of that difference. The other thing I would tell students to do is to talk to people whenever and wherever you can. And there's going to be some failures. There's going to be people who don't want to talk to you. There are going to be people who you perceive as rude, or who put you in a category or stereotype you. And first of all, that's a good experience. It's good to feel what it's like to be the other. But there are also a whole host of people who are eager to talk, who are curious about you, who welcome the opportunity for dialogue, for cultural exchange, and can provide you such levels of insight that you only get by being in their home, in their comfort zone, in their place, and showing genuine respect and curiosity. So these conversations can take place all the time. It can be with the taxi driver on the way home. It can be a few extra minutes with the store clerk when the store is not busy. It can be going to the same shop all the time and becoming friends with the barista or with the shop owner and having them those entrees to talk a little bit more. That's what I'd say.
So switching gears a little bit to writing this book, what did you enjoy most about the writing process? Getting all of those thoughts onto paper.
Just that. I really love the idea of crafting idea into thought. As a linguist by training, I find the idea of language and word and communication to be a really fascinating phenomenon, and the sense that we have things in our heads that need order and structure to be put out there to be understood by someone else is a really rich and rewarding process for me. So I just love the craft of taking thought and putting it into words. But I also like the discovery process, and for me a lot of this process was uncovering and articulating what it means to be a global citizen. As I said, I really started this process by seeking out other people telling me what it meant to be a global citizen. And along the way, I found that there wasn't a great place or resource that had that out there. And I thought, well, then I'm going to invent it. I'm going to put it out there. I'm going to to produce this. And so for me, the process of discovery, uncovery that comes from thinking deeply about these things and trying to present it in ways that are broadly applicable to other people was a really, really rewarding process.
Then on the flip side of that, what was the hardest part?
I'm sure, like lots of people, the hardest part is sort of the white page syndrome, this opening up and seeing that white page and like, how do you get started? And so to combat that, I always say I start by writing like I talk. I'm telling someone a story and I can make it pretty later. But that takes time and work too. So that's the other hard part of the process is I want it to come out eloquent and beautiful and in a thoughtful way. And so often it's a stream of consciousness with a lot of repetitive kind of mundane words, and taking that time to pretty it up and to make it sound like what I wanted in terms of an eloquent and thoughtful and articulate piece was hard.
Yeah, I can imagine. What kind of books do you like reading in your spare time?
I really love a whole range of genres, but right now I'm really fascinated by memoirs because I like knowing people's stories. I like hearing firsthand accounts of people's experiences. The couple that I read recently include Educated by Tara Westover and Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, both really fascinating memoirs. And I really like nonfiction right now too, things that describe psychology and sociology and how people work, how we work as humans, what makes us tick. I just find nonfiction to be really fascinating. And things on global issues. I'm always interested in these phenomenon of problems and issues that we need to solve in the world.
What's, more broadly speaking of books, what cultural value do you see in books as a form, as a craft?
Yeah. As an interculturalist, I really admire and respect cultures that have an oral tradition. And yet I gravitate personally to the written tradition, to books, because I think it's a way to preserve stories in space and time, a way to capture thoughts and feelings and share those in really broad and meaningful ways. The idea of being able to go back to books at different periods of time and see how they resonate differently, the ability to look at a phrase, to hone in on a sentence and really process what that means and how it resonates with you. To me, that is one of the great values of books, that written thoughtfulness that goes into it allows a thoughtfulness in return when you receive the book, when you receive it. And so for me, the cultural value of it is that ability to span space and time and to continually go back and learn new things from it.
So do you have any ideas or plans for future writing projects?
I do. I thought I'd be so happy once this was done, and then I found this vacuum of time, and I just keep wanting to go back to writing again. I find that I really love the process. But to me, the really interesting and humbling part of this has been the number of people that have said, I'm really interested in your work, I'm interested in your topic, and I'm so flattered by that. But when I wrote the book, I didn't necessarily intend it for a broad audience. I was writing it with a narrow audience in mind of faculty and study abroad educators and things like that. So my inspiration right now is I want something similar to sort of put out there and share more broadly. Something that's sort of a little bit more memoir, but also call to action on what it means to be a global citizen and what it means to really let the world in and be kind and respectful of this amazing, diverse world that we have.
Is there anything that you have wanted to share about the book, or are there any questions that you want to be asked that you haven't been asked about the book?
For me, the goal of the book, the idea behind this is that Just like you can't take students to a library and think that they're going to read, you can't take students abroad and think that they're going to know anything about the world, that they're going to learn anything about the culture. So we have to embed this intentionality into our programming, and we have to embed these kinds of articulated experiences and opportunities for students to develop these transferable skills. And so why is this important? Like, who cares except for people who study abroad? Well, I think the world cares. I think universities care because this is embedded into university mission statements. This is embedded into TCU's mission statement that we want to have global citizens. And it doesn't happen just by developing and sending students abroad. It happens when we have intentional, thoughtful programs that build an opportunity for students to process and reflect and act on these things that they're doing and learning abroad. Otherwise, it's just sightseeing and touring. So my number one message that I want to share about this, not just the book in particular, just global citizenship in general, is that if we want to build global citizens, if we want to produce students who are able to negotiate and interact in thoughtful, respectful, appropriate, and effective ways in the world, then we need to start with developing those skill sets for them in really thoughtful and strategic ways.